think we can go ahead and get started, Jesse.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We're glad that you are able to join us. We're happy that you're here. We are excited about the workshop. Thank you everyone who helped put today's event together, our organizers and our speaker. Welcome to our pre-conference workshop for our annual Texas Oral History Association conference. My name is Jesse Esparza, and I am the program chair for TOHA. As I was mentioning, we are excited about the workshop today, and we believe that you will as well once you hear from our speaker. It's my honor and it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Sara Zenaida Gould, who is currently the interim director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, or MACRI, an organization based out of San Antonio, which is dedicated to collecting, recording, and educating future generations on the accomplishments of Mexican Americans, particularly in the areas of civil rights activism. Dr. Gould is, in fact, a founding board member of MACRI. She's also held several fellowships at the Smithsonian Institute, the Winterthur Museum, and the American Antiquarian Society, and is a National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Leadership Institute alumna. As a lead curator at the University of Texas in San Antonio for the Institute of Texan Cultures, she curated over a dozen exhibits on history, art, and managed one of the state's most significant oral history programs. Today, we are privileged to hear about Dr. Gould's former role as the founding director of the Museo del Westside, a community-based and hands-on museum launched by the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, also there in San Antonio. Dr. Gould, thank you for joining us and thank you for sharing your work. I turn the floor over to you. Oh, if I may, I'm sorry. After Dr. Gould's presentation, we will hold a Q&A session. So please hold on to those questions. You can also post those in the chat and we'll be collecting those and we can have a conversation after Gould's presentation, Dr. Gould's presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jesse. Thank you for inviting me. I have been coming to TOHA conferences for, I don't know, almost 10 years, not quite that long, but almost. So it's nice to be with you. I do want to just start by taking a moment to acknowledge the circumstances of our meeting today. You know, of course, we were originally going to gather in person this spring at Baylor, and now we're here in front of our computers, and you know, on the one hand, this technology is fantastic in that we're able to still have these gatherings, although they're virtual. But I think it's also really important to just acknowledge the struggle for so many people who have limited internet access or technological access, and how much work we still have to do to connect people with this great technology that many of us do have the privilege to have access to. I have primarily been working in working class communities for the last few years and come from a working class community. And so I'm very aware of the digital divide and how it continues to really harm us. I also just want to acknowledge that as we're experiencing this pandemic and as we're able to gather virtually, this pandemic is, of course, disproportionately impacting communities of color and low-income communities. And a lot of people are suffering right now, whether they're suffering from financial strain or the drastic increase in domestic violence cases, the increase in substance abuse and addiction relapse. This pandemic is causing all kinds of upheaval in our communities. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge that this pandemic, I think, has allowed us to bring certain issues to the forefront about disparities in our society, including the ongoing struggle to end racial discrimination and racial violence, a struggle that we have been fighting for some 500 years. And so I do hope that some changes come out of this and that we are all working towards increasing equity in our communities in whatever ways that we can. So I'm based in San Antonio, which is the ancestral home of, I'm going to read a list, Harame, Payaya, Pamaya, Pahalache, Aranama, Tamike, Pachal, and so many others, all of whom have their own languages, their own religions, their own cultures, their own traditions, including oral traditions, which brings us together today. And also, finally, I also just want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the anniversary of one of the most traumatic experiences that many of us will have ever lived through, September 11th. And I know that's something that I carry with me to this day. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But I'm a longtime public historian. And I will say, though, it took me a while to figure out how to get from, I don't know, point A to point B. And it took me a while to, I guess, commit to this path, part of which was that as an undergrad, I did a couple of museum archive internships and loved it, but at the same time, this was the late 90s. It was the era of Pete Wilson and a lot of anti-Mexican rhetoric, which I know doesn't sound that new anymore, but it was really disturbing to me. And I was having this sort of conflict about, is it okay for me to go into museum work when my community is being attacked by, you know, government officials? And my senior year in college, I had an internship at the National Office of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is an organization that my grandparents had been really active in back in the day. And then, like, you know, things happened, honestly, you know, sort of financial responsibilities, I think, required particularly my grandmother to not be as civically engaged as she had been in the 50s and 60s. And, you know, it's also just kind of a reminder of the way that capitalism kind of like sucks you in and makes you think that you can buy your way to happiness. Anyway, what I did not know then when I graduated from college was that there was, in fact, a path where I could do social justice work and museum work at the same time. And I just didn't know that yet. So I moved to New York, and I worked for an alternative to incarceration program for nonviolent drug offenders in a predominantly Latino community. And this was in the era when the 3 strikes rules were very common. So if you had even a minor drug offense 3 times, you'd be sent to prison for a very long time. And so this was a program attempting to redirect that. And while I was doing that, I was going to NYU through their continuing ed program to study fundraising. And as part of that, I just needed an elective. And so I took an elective in museum exhibit design, and that kind of got me back in the, you know, thinking about museums. And then September 11th happened, and I was in Lower Manhattan that morning at a community health center where I was working at that point. And it just really got me thinking about that path not taken and about going back to the public history realm. So anyway, that's just a little background and some things that are in my head today. When I went back to grad school, I really did think, okay, I'm gonna become a museum curator. I'm gonna go into museum work, and started doing various internships and fellowships at museums. But I also got at that point a sort of a casual introduction to oral history through research that I was doing that hadn't really been documented. And so I was looking for people to fill in the gaps of those stories. After finishing my PhD, I ended up back in Texas, my home state, and I was at the Institute of Texan Cultures, which does have this fantastic oral history collection that's been going since the 70s. And that was, that came under my purview to take care of that collection and grow that collection. So it opened this opportunity for me to take a really great collection and look to diversify it more, because what I was finding is that the collection was more heavily weighted towards male voices, as well as more heavily weighted towards you know, what we call in Texas Anglo voices. And so I was just looking to see how can I keep expanding this story. And what I really want to acknowledge is that there is so much grassroots history work in all of our communities, wherever you live. I imagine there's somebody doing grassroots history work. Some of you watching this might be doing grassroots history work. And so I just want to acknowledge that that work is happening, and it is happening in communities of color too. And that work is often not acknowledged by larger institutions, by universities, by larger museums. And sometimes that work is in fact in conflict with more academic historians. And so I have been thinking a lot throughout my career about how do we break down gatekeepers? How do we open up public history to more people? How do we acknowledge the work that other people are doing and give it its due credit? Again, I live in San Antonio, and it's a city where history can just be seen all around us. You know, at every corner, there's something. This is also a city that is predominantly Mexican American. It is predominantly working class. But it's a city where our culture is often used to attract tourists, to attract tourist dollars, and where, you know, on the one hand, our culture is a money-making thing, but it's not necessarily recognized in powerful places. So oftentimes that working class Mexican American culture that dominates the city is not at the table when major decisions are made. And so, you know, when I moved to San Antonio and I was working at ITC and we were doing a lot of cool things at ITC, one of the things that really kind of bothered me was how are we really connecting with the local community? And this was a challenge because on the one hand, our mandate was to be a statewide museum, not a local museum. But we are living in this big city, and it just felt like we weren't always doing a good job of connecting with communities. So on my own hours, I was doing a lot of volunteer work, particularly on the Westside, which is kind of the heart of Mexican American San Antonio. And in doing that work, I got involved with an organization called the Westside Preservation Alliance, which is working to preserve working class architecture and the landscape of the city. And at the time, I ended up getting very immersed in this sort of local historic preservation movement and thinking about, again, what are the gatekeepers to a better citywide acknowledgement of this history, and how can we, you know, get past those gates? And so in 2014, I was involved in the creation of a national organization called Latinos in Heritage Conservation. I co-founded that with two friends from California, and we now have membership across the country. You know, if things work out, we'll be having our next national gathering next September in Denver. Hopefully we can travel again. But we have a national gathering every other year to talk about historic preservation within Latino communities. And why am I telling you all of this? Oral history and place go hand in hand. So when we're thinking about the history of a place, so often the best way to get that history is through oral history. So we'll talk about that some more, but I just wanted to bring you up to that. So, so you know, I had been thinking about how do I keep inserting social justice into my work as a public historian. And, you know, one of my favorite Cheech Marin sayings, I don't know if you follow him, but one of the things he likes to say is you have to slip it in your coffee. And he's not talking about roofies, of course. He's talking about culture and kind of anti-racist thinking when he's talking about how the humor that he used in Cheech and Chong movies was about dismantling and making fun of white supremacy and stereotypes and prejudices and that sort of thing. And so, you know, to a certain extent, I hope that we all attempt to do that, where we just sort of slip things into our work subtly. But I also think if you have the ability, if you have this, I don't know, the opportunity, sometimes it's just time to do something that's a lot more bold and not so subtle. So I eventually, but I had some great experiences at ITC, but I eventually did leave for the opportunity to start a community museum on the Westside. And that was the Museo del Westside. And I'm gonna just show you some slides to explain to you the process behind creating that. So there had never been a museum on the Westside, and within the community, I think, you know, on the one hand, there was like, oh, that's exciting, but there was also like, okay, but what is that? And so we took an approach to include the community in the creation of this, and I'm going to just show you a bit about that. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is just the tagline, sorry, could not think about it. Tagline. The tagline for the Museo was at the corner of history and social justice, and still is the tagline. The Museo is situated at the Rinconcito de Esperanza, which is the west side location of the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. It is on a corner, and so that's by Rinconcito. So the tagline was at the corner of history and social justice. We assembled a team to start with the planning process, which included the executive director of the Esperanza, myself. We brought in an architect who had a history of working with Esperanza on community design projects, meaning that he was an architect who was willing to meet with the community, hear what the community wanted to see, you know, everything from shapes and colors, you know, all of that stuff, specific features they wanted to see. And so Dwayne has been working with Esperanza for a number of years on different projects, including historic rehabilitation projects. And then one of his former students who actually worked on a project with Esperanza when he was still a student and now has his own construction firm, he came on board too, Arturo Vilchis. We did bring in a consultant from the Texas, well, in his day job, he works for the Texas Historical Commission, but then we were able to hire him on the side to do some consulting, David Grabitsky. And then we also created an advisory committee of neighbors in the community, people from the neighborhood. And so they got involved in the process of figuring out what exactly is this going to be, what is our mission going to be, all of that. So just a little background, the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center purchased the northern half of the Rinconcito de Esperanza in 2001. So north, for what you're looking at, is going to be, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's this number 1 here. And so they purchased this part in 2001. They purchased that to be the home base for its Artes Vida Westside Cultural Project, which is a series of arts workshops for the West Side. So West Side residents making culturally grounded art, whether it's visual art, spoken word, writing workshops, a lot of different things. And then in 2007, they were able to buy the southern part of this property. So that's this part. On the southern part is the building that was then designated for the future home a museum. At the time, they really had no plan other than one day we want to have a museum there. And so it wasn't until, sorry, I just skipped ahead. It wasn't until, what was it, 2018 that they hired me. So in 2008, they brainstormed, one day we want to have a museum there. 10 years later, they hired me to get it off the ground. So in that time, they had been rehabilitating. So that building number 1, they completely rehabbed that historic house. They completely rehabbed this little casita at number 3. And then they built from scratch an adobe structure back here, number 10. The first adobe structure built in the Westside in about a century. So if you don't know this story, in places like San Antonio, adobe more or less got legislated out of existence because of laws around building. So adobe used to be very common, and then it just got knocked out because it didn't meet modern standards. Anyway, that's being in multiple places. They're trying to reverse that. Like, I don't know if you've heard about what's happening in Marfa, but right now in Marfa, in that whole county, adobe is being taxed like a wooden structure, which is basically making adobe only for the rich, which is odd, right? Because it's a mud house. Community was really talking about, well, what does a museum mean? And what will that mean for us? And so there was just some education around what is the sort of official definition of a museum, and what exactly does a museum do? So where we talked about the different types of institutions that qualify as museums within the world of museums and all kinds, right? And we were really looking at being a sort of a local, very local history museum. But certainly we were looking to acquire, conserve, research, communicate, and exhibit the tangible and intangible heritage of the Westside. And so by calling ourselves a community museum, we were thinking about telling that history of the local, but we were also calling it a museum, meaning that we would focus on the local by working with community members. Tell us, these are the things we want exhibits about, and here's what we want included, and here's stories that work towards that inclusion. So this is where oral history was starting to play a very significant role in the creation of this museum. And then in terms of trying to define how we fit into the larger framework of Esperanza's work and the Rinconcito de Esperanza, we started thinking about how, okay, well, so the Museo is going to be this community participatory museum complex that brings together Esperanza's history-related programming with exhibits guided by the needs, the interests, the input of the community. That yes, we would collect things and then we would conserve them, we would put them on display. We would also be collecting oral histories, photographs, artifacts, things that would tell the community stories, not just from the distant past, but also from what's happening right now in this community. What are the most pressing things happening here? And what is the future that we want for our community? One of the things, I'm gonna keep talking about this throughout the conversation here, but one of the things that is a huge threat on the Westside right now, and in lots of communities of color, is gentrification. Other neighborhoods that are downtown adjacent in San Antonio have already been pretty gentrified. The Westside was in a way protected from that gentrification because of some railroads that separated the Westside. They're still there, that separate the Westside from downtown, and also some bridges that you have to drive over to get over those railroads to get into the Westside. So there were kind of these physical barriers that have held back the gentrification for a number of years, but it increasingly looks like those physical barriers aren't going to be enough anymore. the interest in luxury downtown living has just been spilling over. And so even though oftentimes museums think about the past, we were really concerned about not just the past, but also the future. And is the West Side still going to exist in 10, 20, 30 years? We also wanted to create a space that was really open to the community, that people would feel like it was sort of an extension of their backyard or an extension of their home. So we wanted it to be both a educational space where people could share and learn about the West Side, but also a social space and a place for the sharing of knowledge and fellowship. So our community advisory committee came up with a mission statement after a series of meetings of hashing out what all of these ideas would add up to. And so this is what they came up with. The Museo del Westside is dedicated to preserving and presenting the unique history, heritage, culture, pride, work ethic, and diverse experiences of la gente del Westside to increase understanding and appreciation by building and strengthening knowledge of the West Side in order to create a more vibrant future for our community. And then a couple of months later, they came up with a vision statement. And we called these working because we were always thinking of them as sort of living documents, things that could evolve as need be. So their working vision statement was recognizing the transformative power of telling our stories. We envision a community that honors the rich histories and cultures of the West Side, including its Mexican-American corazon, by inviting community participation, embracing community knowledge, and being good stewards of community-sourced collections. We create bridges between people by exchanging ideas and educating and empowering each other to promote human dignity and sustain our community. And then we just also came up with things that we wanted to do. So we wanted to be a site of inquiry into local history and contemporary issues. We also really wanted to be a site of affirmation of that community-held knowledge, that community history, and the value of that knowledge and of that history. We wanted to serve as a site of resistance to the marginalization and erasure of community history, which is I have to tell you, it's really, it's strange living in a city that's so tourist driven, and maybe other people have this experience too, but it's like the people who literally do the work to keep the city running are not acknowledged in exhibits at some of the larger museums in town. It's like they don't exist. And so, it's like in Harry Potter, and you've got those house elves, right? But like, we're not house elves. And so that was very important, that making visible this community history. We wanted to fill in the gaps. We wanted to tell stories and offer perspectives not found at other museums. We wanted to promote community knowledge and to inspire self-reflection and dialogue. And then, of course, we wanted to foster that love and appreciation and understanding of San Antonio's historic West Side. There's a lot of community pride in the West Side. So even if other folks don't see the West Side, in the West Side there is an awful lot of pride. We wanted this to be free to the community. We wanted it to be relevant to the community. And so we were having these regular meetings, open meetings with the community to collect ideas for future exhibits and programs. We wanted it to not be super narrow. We wanted to talk about West Side history. We wanted to talk about West Side art. We want to talk about West Side culture. We also wanted to talk about, again, those struggles that the West Side was facing right now. Things like gentrification, things like hunger, things like domestic violence, all kinds of things. We really saw that we had the potential to create some long-term exhibits about the history of the West Side, as well as rotating themed exhibits. And the Museo is located within walking distance of several schools. J.T. Brackenridge Elementary is like a block away. Tafoya Middle School is just a few blocks more, and Lanier is in between, high school. There's also within walking distance the Guadalupe Community Center, which is a place where a lot of seniors go in the daytime, and multiple arts organizations that kind of came out of the Chicano movement and promote Mexican-American art. We also have the Esperanza Corazones, which is a group of mostly senior citizens who volunteer with Esperanza and come up with their own programs. They have their own programming that they do. And then the Buena Gente de Esperanza, which are Esperanza's volunteer corps. We were particularly interested in partnering with the local schools. The idea was to create a junior docents program to help students get some experience for their CVs, for their resumes, and to help, with things like public speaking and that sort of thing. We also were interested in working with the social studies teachers to help come up with topics that the students might be interested in contributing to. At the local high school, at Lanier High School, they actually have an architecture and construction program. And so we were looking into partnering with them to do some actual exhibit design work and possibly also help with the building through their construction program. Right away, we were able to offer walking tours to students, and also we created an exhibit called Los Courts about the Alazan Apache Courts, which just down the street, and I'm going to show you a video later, but just down the street from the Museo del Westside is the San Antonio's oldest and largest extant public housing community, which is called the Alazan Apache Courts, or we call it Los Courts. And so we created an exhibit about the history of Los Courts. And I'll tell you more about it in a minute, but we have this traveling exhibit. And so that was available. And then actually, we were supposed to have a traveling exhibit this year on women and activism in the West Side to commemorate the centennial of the 19th Amendment. Because of the pandemic, that actually became a digital exhibit. And so you can visit that exhibit at museodelwestside.org. Once the construction was done, we of course wanted to be able to offer field trips and a research center for people to come in and do research. The Esperanza has been collecting historical photos, digitizing historical photos from the community for 10 plus years now. And so they have a really nice collection of digital photos. And also they have been doing oral histories for a number of years. The way that Esperanza has been doing oral histories is a little bit different than what I'm going to talk about, actually. But this was something that I was also involved in when I was on staff, and that's that they do a monthly oral history gathering where people sit in a big circle and there's a specific topic for that day, and they have a group conversation about what they remember about that topic. It is very different than the way that I learned to do oral history as sort of a one-on-one thing. And I'll tell you, it is a little bit of a nightmare for transcription purposes, but it does serve a purpose. It's a really popular social event, especially for elders, but a lot of times they will bring a kid or a grandkid with them so that they get to hear these stories too. It starts always with a potluck breakfast. So there's just a lot of socializing. And now, of course, this has been on hold since the pandemic started, but they have years worth of these group oral histories that are recorded, so that they do get recorded on video. And so that's just a whole other method that I'm not going to talk about today, but it's very much part of that sort of the ethos of Esperanza, that everybody has a story to tell, and let's do it in a communal fashion. So this is the building that was identified for the home of the Museo del Westside. It is a former ice house, and so those of you Texans know about the Texas ice houses. The part that has the pitched roof here, this was the original part of the structure and was originally a tiendita, or a little grocery store. And in the West Side, like a lot of places, you used to be able to find a little tiendita or a little grocery store on almost, every other corner, so that you would just go down to the corner store and get your basic staples. This tiendita was built in the 30s, and then, and it continued to be a little store until about the 70s. Next door is this concrete block structure that was built in the late 50s. It was added on by the family who purchased the tiendita. They added this on in order to create the ice house. And so inside of this building, there is still the ice cooler where the ice and the beer were kept. In the back, they had a grill, and they made hamburgers and sold hamburgers. And in the very back, in the backyard, there were picnic tables and that sort of thing, so you could sit out there. So Esperanza actually purchased this building from the family. The business closed, and the family had just been holding on to it for a couple of decades. And they just, I think, that attachment to their family business was there. And this is a great story. They actually had another buyer lined up who was willing to give them more money, but that buyer said that their plan was to tear it down. And Esperanza came and said, well, we don't have that much money, but we can give you this and we won't tear it down. And so they sold it to Esperanza. And like I said, so Esperanza bought it in 2007. The following year, they came up with the idea, well, one day we want to have a museum there. And they didn't hire me until 2018. So they were just kind of sitting on it for a while. They did, after they bought it, they did immediately replace the roof to prevent water damage. They put roof, insulation, but just sort of the basics. Things that we needed to do, because they hadn't been done yet, included upgrading, complete overhaul for the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, because of course that's a very sensitive area for museums, putting in a new lighting system, a fire suppression system, adding security system, using materials that would have limited off-gassing, and then of course instituting some strict pest management procedures to protect anything in the building. I'm just going to show you some pictures. So this was a very fun part of the project, working with Dwayne and Arturo on these drawings. So this is Dwayne's hand-drawn rendering of the building. Oops, let me just go back to this for a second. The original footprint is basically this front half, or the western half. And then we planned to do an addition. Now the addition was going to sit on the footprint of what had originally been part of the structure, but by the time Esperanza bought the building, the thing that had been sitting on this, there's a concrete pad there, but what had been sitting there was long gone. So only the pad remains. So the idea was to stay true to the historic footprint of the building, but then put in that addition. And the addition is still happening. The addition is going to be a compressed earth block or adobe, the same material that was used for that back building that I talked about that was added. I'm sorry, I have a very sensitive mouse pad here. And this is just a side view, so you can see. And I think that image didn't load. Let's see, here's another one. So here's a computer rendering of the building. So this is the ice house, which is the concrete block. And then this is the addition built out of adobe. And then this is the adobe building that was built a couple of years ago. And then this is the porch of the Casa de Cuentos, which is one of the rehabbed historic structures. And there's another side. One of the ideas for this big adobe wall was what they did on the other adobe building, which is called Mujer Artes, And Mujer Artes houses a women's clay collective. And so the women who work in that clay collective decorated the exterior of their adobe building with earth paints and also tiles that they made and then embedded in the adobe. So the idea was to basically use this wall as a giant canvas to create some kind of image. And I think, you know, one of the future steps is going to be having a series of community meetings to decide what is it going to be in that space. And some more. And there's a bird's eye view, so you can see all of the buildings. And so this is Casa de Cuentos, which has been rehabbed. The Casita, this has been rehabbed. Mujer Artes, which is the new adobe structure. Ruben's Ice House, which is going to be rehabbed. And then the new addition, again, sitting on the original footprint of what had been there. And there's a street view. So you can just see, this is Casa de Cuentos, this is Ruben's over here. Esperanza was also able to acquire these two, well, it looks like two houses. Believe it or not, this lot contains 7 small houses. And I'm really proud to say that, oh gosh, a month ago, we got the Rinconcito de Esperanza, so that's from this White House all the way down here to Ruben's. We got that designated a historic district in San Antonio. It is the first historic district in San Antonio's Westside, which should be appalling to you, because how in the world can one of the most historic neighborhoods in San Antonio have never had a historic district? And I can tell you there have been attempts before to create historic districts in the Westside, and there were interventions by developers to stop that. So because Esperanza owned all of these adjacent lots, because it was 100% owned by them, there was no way for the community to object. So anyway, we were able to create this historic district. Hopefully not the last historic district in the Westside. These structures, they only acquired them maybe 2-3 years ago, and there are currently plans to rehab them. And there's another view of them. Okay, I just wanted to talk briefly about just sort of, you know, this value of these small local museums. There are so many, including a couple in Texas, like Project Row House down in Houston. Heritage Society, not quite as small, but still that idea of preserving older houses so that you can see how people lived over time. It's a little odd in that the houses, of course, would never have actually been in the same neighborhood, right? It's like a false concept of a neighborhood there. But still, the houses are being preserved. In Brooklyn, the City Reliquary, if you ever get a chance to go there. Museo del Norte in Mexican Town in Detroit. Detroit has this historic community of Mexican Americans at the foot of the bridge that connects Detroit to Windsor, Canada. So area where a lot of migrant farm workers come in and out, but also people have settled and been there for generations. And so this is a community museum there. The Backstreet Cultural Museum in New Orleans, one of the coolest places to visit in New Orleans. Museo Urbano in El Paso, which I think most TOHA members are familiar with. One of the co-founders is, of course, Yolanda Leiva Chavez, who has been a speaker at TOHA before. And there she's over here in this picture. And the Lower Ninth Ward Living Museum in New Orleans. We always were looking for opportunities to tell people, this is your museum, share your ideas, share your exhibit ideas. I do want to tell you, don't contact me there because I don't work there anymore, although if you want to contact somebody at the Museo, that email address does still work. Let's see. So that takes me to, of course, we wanted to do this museum where everybody gets to share their stories, gets to share their thoughts, gets to be embedded in the work that the museum does. And so that meant, of course, that we really wanted to put a big emphasis on oral history. And so Humanities Texas helped us out a lot. We got a grant with them to create community oral history kits. I think we started out with 3 of these, and I laid this out for you in case you're interested in doing something like this. So each kit cost at the time, I haven't checked these prices in a while, but at the time each kit cost under $500. And we started out with 3. I think the plan was to expand. But the idea was, okay, we're going to get these kits, and then we're going to have workshops. We're going to invite anybody in the community who wants, and we're going to have them at a series of locations around the community to make it really easy for people to get there. We're going to have them on different kinds of days. So, you know, an after work weekday, a Saturday. We went on another day when the senior citizens gather for a particular I don't know, they get lunch and stuff at the Guadalupe Center. And so, you know, we were just thinking about where are the people, how do we get to them? And so we took these kits and we did trainings with them. So this is just, you know, sort of an announcement about the training workshops. And sorry, I thought there was another slide. Excellent. And then so I'm just going to sort of walk you through how we did this with the community, because in most cases, we are talking about people coming to these workshops either because it was just at the, like I said, like it was at the senior center where they always went on a Tuesday, and so they just walked into something without necessarily knowing what it was, or maybe they did know something like this was going to happen, but probably had never done any oral history before. So this was trying to attract a brand new audience. So, you know, we just started out with the real basics about what is oral history and why do we collect them. And I'm happy to share this with anybody if you want to do something like this. Just explain that in particular, what I like to tell people is that oral histories are oftentimes only in that person's head who you're speaking to, right? You could speak to all of their siblings and never get that same story. So that is something that I always like to drive home, that, you know, don't discount somebody. They have a story too. And just, you know, who are these people who are using oral histories? And of course, there's all these academics who use oral histories, but it's also so great for just local community history projects, as well as, of course, all of the genealogists who are trying to get their family history down. For a lot of Mexican Americans, and I'm sure this is not just true for us, but for a lot of Mexican Americans, genealogy is a real challenge. Our records aren't always very easy to find. Our records aren't necessarily in Ancestry.com. Sometimes it's like, oh, maybe you need to go to Mexico to find that. And so being able to talk to your family and knowing how to record that information from their family is really great for those people who are wanting to learn more about their family history. And then the things that I always want to emphasize with anybody, whether they're just a curious community member or a grad student, is that to me, the real value in oral history is that it makes you a better person. It makes you more empathetic. It makes you a better listener. And also, super important, the #1 rule of oral history is respect, right? Whatever somebody is telling you, that's their story. They don't have to tell you that. They're offering you a gift by sharing that with you. So, you know, whatever you may think about their story, you want to be respectful. And then there's some basics, right, to explain. These are the big picture steps that we're going to walk through. So we're going to have some kind of idea of what it is we're trying to accomplish, what it is we're trying to learn, identify who we think can tell us that. So for example, if you're trying to figure out, how did my family end up in San Antonio? If that's your question, well then who best will know that? Who will know the answer to that? And so that's who you should go and talk to. And then when you go and talk to them, they might be able to point you to somebody else too. Of course, you want to prepare in advance, make some questions, know your equipment, and then when you get there, listen, right? As much time as we might put into crafting the perfect questions, it's always really about the listening, I think, I don't know. So let them speak in their own words. Don't talk over them or try to fill in a sentence for them if they start to, stutter a little bit because they're trying to remember something. Let them tell it in their own speed. If they go off on wild tangents, that's fine. Let them do that. And then when they stop talking, ask some follow-up questions to get back to where you were trying to go. I put, again, the equipment that we purchased for the kits in case you need some ideas. There's all kinds of things you can find these days. So I'm sure you can figure out something good, but if these things seem to work. My goal was always to buy things that were not terribly expensive and yet had good enough quality that I could create edited videos maybe for an exhibit down the road, or edited audio that we could put on the radio down the road. Esperanza has a community radio station. So we wanted things that were quality enough that we could use them in other media, but not so high quality that we would be afraid to give the kit to anybody, right? I mean, the whole purpose was to hand these kits out to people and say, go do it, So we didn't want anything to be terribly expensive. We talk a lot about what to do in preparation so that you feel comfortable, so that you feel confident and ready to go and do that oral history. And so I just created this kind of pre-interview, and I didn't create it. Look at the bottom. It says adapted from Linda P. Wood Oral History Projects in Your Classroom. So check that out. But that I thought worked well for this community project to just help people feel like they're ready to go. And also in there, they all got the kits were inside of a backpack, and in the backpack there was a folder, a pocket folder, 2 pockets folder, and on one side was sort of the pre-interview stuff for you to make sure you remembered all of your steps and just, to do a little like practice at home beforehand, including this pre-interview form. On the other side was the release form, so that you would use that side when you actually got to the interview. Of course, we want to talk beforehand about making sure you approach everything in a way that is respectful, and that's going to end up with a good product. So, I always emphasize if somebody says, well, I could do Tuesday at 1, but I have to be at the doctor by 2. Well, then don't do it Tuesday at 1, right? Let's maybe look at Wednesday. So really try to find a truly good time, not I suppose I could squeeze it in time, but like a really good time. And then that way everybody is a little more relaxed, they don't feel rushed. And also you want to schedule these things in advance so that the person can just sort of be mentally prepared for the interview. Always, of course, want to have your recording session in some kind of quiet space. I always think before you actually go to see the person, or maybe these days before you do a Zoom call with a person, make sure they understand what you're really wanting to know. You don't have to give them your whole list of questions, but if you could just give them a sample so that they understand, oh, this is what she wants to know. And they can start thinking about it so that when you actually get to the interview day, they're not like scrambling to try to find those memories in their head, but instead they've had a few days to sort of, have those memories percolating in their head. Just, I also think it'll be easier for you as the interviewer if that person has had that time to mentally prepare, right? Of course, you always want to check your kit bag beforehand to make sure that everything is in there. And in fact, at the front of the kit, there's a list, like a checklist to make sure everything is in the kit. So you can just go down that list and make sure I see everything in my kit before I leave the house. I always provide them with sample questions. And again, in that folder that's in the backpack are some additional sample questions, although I do really encourage people to create your own questions. You don't have to stick with these. These are just to help you get your thoughts going. A little bit more on the quiet spot. Of course, your equipment will pick up all kinds of ambient noise, and so you do want to just be careful about that. There are some things that are totally unavoidable, like, you know, the mailman comes and so the dog starts barking. You just pause, you wait for the mailman to leave, the dog will calm down, you know. Public space is not good. I think y'all know that. You know, pre-pandemic, I personally really liked going to people's homes because I think people tend to feel comfortable in their own home. And the other thing is that in people's homes, you often have these kind of touchstones that might help people remember something. So if they've got, you know, photo of their parents or photo of, you know, something, or if they've got some kind of certificate on the wall, and you can ask them about that. So I really like going to people's homes. I realize that's not so possible right now, but hopefully we'll be back to that place soon. You always want to make sure that whoever you're talking to is comfortable. So for example, if you go to somebody's house and they have an area of their home that's kind of like only for guests, and maybe that furniture is a little formal and not that comfortable, that might not be the best place for a 1-hour conversation because it might be a little uncomfortable. You know, maybe the kitchen table is actually going to be more comfortable for them. So just try to ask them, where do you feel comfortable? Of course, you want to avoid swivel chairs. I do everything on video because so many of the oral histories end up as parts of exhibits. Video is just, you know, more visual, obviously. When people are in swivel chairs, they oftentimes will kind of like unconsciously start doing this, and then they just look kind of funny on the screen. To me, as part of that respect is the #1 rule of oral history, I don't want to do anything that will make somebody look bad. So if I know that they're starting to do this, you know, I might say, maybe we should move, you know, or I would just try to stop that from the beginning, that they wouldn't sit in a swivel chair. Same thing with things like lighting. You know, if I realize that somebody's in a heavy shadow, I don't want to represent them in a heavy shadow, right? That wouldn't really be a respectful thing. So can we turn on some lights? Is it okay if I move this lamp over here? I'll move it back when we're done, something like that. Of course, you always want to have done a test run of your equipment. The equipment that I purchased for this program ran on rechargeable batteries, and we had multiple charged batteries in the pack, and I just sewed up these really easy to make drawstring bags, a green one, a red one. Green drawstring bag had your charged batteries. When you use them up, you put them in the red bag so that they would get charged when you return the kit. If you are using the tape recorder, and I know I call it tape recorder, it's not a tape recorder, it's an digital audio recorder. I usually use both the camera and the digital audio recorder just in case there was some mishap. Hopefully both of them didn't fail, hopefully only one thing would fail. But if you do have the digital audio recorder, you just want to be careful about where you put it down. Like if they have a glass of water or something, you don't want to put the digital audio recorder right next to the glass of water because every time they pick that up, you know, you're going to get this thump, that sort of thing. So, you know, avoid air vents, avoid, you know, if there's somebody else home who's in another room watching TV, try to be far away from that. This is the basic setup that I usually do. And when we would have these trainings, we would have people break into pairs so they could figure out how to do this. So you have, you know, face-to-face. At a sort of a comfortable distance, camera off to the side, which would catch a 3/4 view of the person you were interviewing. So like this, 3/4 view, which is supposed to be more flattering. I always tell people that, but it is supposed to be more flattering. You try to get even lighting on both sides to the best of your ability. You try to avoid having like a light switch behind their head, something like that. So, you know, if you do ever get a chance to do a program like this, it is kind of fun at a certain point to break people up and let them move around the room and do something like this so they're not just sitting. And of course, you're sitting at a computer, So I feel a little bit like a hypocrite, but if we were in person, I would have you break up and move around. Of course, you got to have your permission slips. And so in giving the training to the community, just want to make sure that they understand that this isn't just some kind of additional hassle, that there's a real reason why we have these release forms. We want to respect the person who is telling us their story and make sure that we do have their permission to be recording this, to be potentially using it in some project down the road. And that, at the beginning, just as a fail-safe in case something were to happen to that written release, at the beginning of the recording, you just have them verbally consent to being recorded. Standard interview agreement. I go over this with them in the training just so that they understand what it is, but I imagine y'all are familiar with this. And then, of course, at the interview, in terms of, again, I'm always worried about when I train community members, I don't want them to think I didn't do a good job. So I want them to feel very confident about the job that they did. And so I'm always encouraging them, start with an easy question. So that way the person will start talking and you feel good because it's not like you landed kind of a dud question, but start with something easy, something that will elicit a story. So if you know the person you're interviewing, which is one of the benefits of having these community oral history programs, is saying, go and interview your neighbors, people you've known for 20 years, but get those stories documented. So if you already know that person, you already have that rapport, you can say, hey, tell me that story you're always telling me about, blah, blah, blah. And then you just know that will elicit a response. Of course, you want to encourage people to try to get those questions that have stories as opposed to just yes or no answers, although sometimes you do need a yes or no answer. And also be very sensitive about some people just don't want to answer certain things. And if they seem to hesitate, don't push too hard because there might be a real reason why they don't want to answer that. Depending on your relationship with the person that you're interviewing, of course, you may or may not want to broach any topics around religion, politics, sexuality. And so we often in the training, we just talk a little bit about, what would you be comfortable having somebody ask you, what would you not, just keep that in mind so that when you go out and do the oral histories, you're not doing anything that would have made you uncomfortable. Also, so important that you take a non-judgment or a no-judgment position. Again, this is one person's experience, story, perspective. It doesn't have to be your experience, story, or perspective. So you don't want to be, I don't know, scowling or shaking your head when somebody tells you their personal story. I like to encourage people to not be afraid to go off their questions. Yes, walk in with questions so okay, I have something to go off of. But if the conversation goes in another direction and it seems relevant and interesting, just let it go there. That's okay. And then also, of course, you don't want to interrupt people. This is especially true for people of color and for women, because too often our stories are overridden by, what we might think of as dominant voices. So it's just so important to show that respect and just let them tell their story without your intervening into it, okay? I do like to try to keep interviews to about an hour. There's some people are real talkers and they have a lot of energy, but I start to lose my own mental capacity at about 2 hours. So if somebody keeps talking at that point, I will say, you have so much to share. Can we schedule a follow-up? Something like that, because it is really hard. Your job as the interviewer, right, is to really be focused on what they're saying, to really be actively listening. And it takes a lot of your mental bandwidth to do that. So you don't want to start like getting tired and looking not interested, or you don't want to like yawn or, you know, sigh heavily while they're still telling you their stories. So if it's sort of, you know, getting to that point, just ask, let's do a part 2. In the training, we go through a lot of these bloopers together. So I usually have them break into small groups and go through these questions. And, you know, I'll just, you know, throw an example. The person you are interviewing starts to cry. This is something that I think everybody who does oral history has run into at some point. And so for me, and you know, we take the opportunity to let people share what they would do. For me, it's always about asking the person, would you like us to take a break? And let them lead that. Because for some people, there's nothing embarrassing about crying. And so for them, they're like, no, you know, it's fine. But for some people, yeah, they don't necessarily want to be on video crying. So we take a break. We put everything on pause. We take a break. We come back. But anyway, so these are just examples of things that we go through in the training. And then after the interview, I do ask them to fill out a post-interview form so that we can just know on the receiving end. So they bring back their kits after they've done oral histories. They can check them out for you know, up to a week or so. But they bring them back, and then that way we just know, are there any things that we should be looking for? Did you have any technical problems? Do we need to do a kind of follow-up with them? For example, if the person had some kind of photos that they wanted to allow us to scan, then we'll schedule a follow-up to do that with them. We also, of course, want to send a thank you note. We want to offer them a copy of the interview. And, you know, with the technology changing now, this is a little tricky because we used to always offer a DVD or a CD if it was just audio. And now, not as many people necessarily have DVD players. So you want to ask them, do you want a copy? And if so, what would be the best format for you? Because maybe a DVD is something that they could play. And if you do a DVD, make sure you save it as a something that can play in a DVD player, which on your DVD burner, it'll ask you those questions, but you just want to make sure it's for a DVD player versus a computer. And then some people, of course, do have computers, and so like a little inexpensive thumb drive might be the more appropriate option for them. Of course, you want to make sure you've got all your signed forms, because when you turn that backpack in, we're going to be looking for the signed form in there. Before you turn in the backpack, people are expected to just double check that they've got all their equipment in the kit. And so this is the thing that's in the front of those backpacks that just shows everything is in there. So you can just make sure you've got everything. You return the kit, and then at Esperanza's end, we would download the data and catalog it. So, and then this is just sort of a, you know, a summary wrap up for the trainees. And then we offer them a bonus. So, okay, maybe they liked the presentation, because again, remember, we would do these presentations around the community just for anybody who we could get to come and watch without necessarily them committing just yet. So at this point, if they were interested in joining the Oral History Corps, we would ask them to just give us their contact information so that we could give them a temporary pass to check out an oral history kit. They would get to take the kit home. They would conduct what we would call, you know, a trial oral history. Bring that back. We would just double check it to make sure that they didn't have any problems with it. Or if they did, no problem, you know, we'll just explain, next time do this, you know. And then they get a little certificate just saying they're part of the Oral History Corps. We also were offering the opportunity for people to do transcriptions, and of course we're following the Baylor Oral History Style Guide. And we were, in particular, just honestly, this was mostly happening with college interns, but just, showing them some tricks with the computer. In the community that we are serving, there really is a big digital divide. And so transcribing, it wasn't easy to get a volunteer base for this, and other than like interns. But I am very hopeful that part of the plan for the Museo was to eventually have one of the little houses that needed to be rehabbed turned into a like a little oral history and / research house where you could come in, use a computer either to search the digital photo collection or to search the oral history collection or to transcribe oral histories there. So hopefully that will be coming down the road for the Museo del Westside, because the digital divide, it's really, really a problem. And this is just, sample transcript. And then this is just talking about that in the future we wanted to have a workspace for volunteer oral history transcribers, but for now, we were able to work with people who could do these things from home. And we did have a couple of people doing this. And then I just recommended some easy to access stuff if they wanted to learn a little bit more, and thank them. So what I wanted to do now is talk to you about a social justice related oral history program that I pitched, when was this? Last November. Last November, I pitched this oral history project, and so it's gonna play a video, I hope. And I'm gonna have to read off of another computer screen, so watch the video, not me, okay? This is Rubens Ice House, a historic structure that will be the permanent home of the new Museo del Westside, a community participatory museum in one of the poorest but also most historic neighborhoods of San Antonio, Texas, and a project of the arts and social justice organization, the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. Directly to the west of downtown, the area never had racial deed restrictions common to other parts of the city, and so it has always been racially diverse. But the Mexican Revolution brought thousands of Mexican refugees to the West Side, and since then it has been the heart of Mexican-American San Antonio. While we lack in financial capital, our community is immensely rich in history and culture. Our vernacular architecture, religious sites, and our plentiful murals, along with our reputation for producing numerous influential Mexican Americans, ranging from visual and performing artists to leaders in education, politics, and business. These include singers like Eva Garza and Gloria Rios, who were also famous here, also famous in Mexico, has resulted in the West Side being described as the Mexican-American cultural capital of the United States of America. However, the West Side experienced a horrific housing shortage in the 1930s during the Great Depression. A local Catholic priest and Jewish architect set out to convince the federal and local governments to step in and authorize the first public housing in San Antonio. Influenced by the worker housing in Valbuena, Mexico City, the Alizana-Pache courts, also called Los Courts, replaced hundreds of makeshift 1- or 2-room wooden structures and provided critical housing for nearly 5,000 Mexican Americans in 1,180 units when they finally opened between 1940 and 1941. Today, despite the fact that more than 30,000 people are on a waiting list for public housing in San Antonio, this public housing has been reduced unit by unit to 1,800 residents in 685 units. Additionally, the Housing Authority has recently confirmed long-rumored plans to demolish the Alizán courts to build mixed-income housing. The Alizán courts are 2 blocks north of the Museo del Westside and about 4 blocks from San Antonio's booming downtown. We have purchased some of the older homes around the museo's site to preserve the traditional built environment of the West Side, But meanwhile, all around us, developers have purchased and demolished dozens of small houses to create vacant lots to sell to bigger developers, to build bigger buildings not meant for us. We all know change is coming. But the residents of the Alazan, I got too fast. But the residents of the Alazan, seen here, are key members of the community we serve. In fact, the president of the Alazan Apache Courts Resident Association serves on the Museo's advisory committee. Residents of those courts have been integral to the culture of the Westside for 80 years. I mentioned De Garza and Gloria Rios. For a time, they lived in those courts. The current residents of those courts have no way of knowing where they will end up or how they will maintain their social networks once their homes are demolished. As a community participatory museum, the Museo del Westside cannot exist without our community. We are worried not only for the loss of homes for the residents of those courts, but also for the loss of community members for our whole neighborhood. What will the Museo look like without these community members? We have a responsibility to stand with them as they face an uncertain future. It is also our uncertain future. I propose to launch a community storytelling initiative with the residents of those courts, starting with oral history, photography, and community mapping workshops so that residents can share in their own words and through their eyes how they feel and think about life at those courts and the changes that are coming, as well as what are their hopes for the future. Through this initiative, we will document the lives of those courts residents and then work with them to create a public presentation of their stories in a medium of their choosing, perhaps through an exhibit, or maybe a book, or maybe a series of radio broadcasts, or even the production of a play based on their stories. We want to create something with a permanent component that will last another 80 plus years, so that their experiences are not lost and so that we can learn from what was done to the residents of those courts. This will be an opportunity to empower the community through personal storytelling, while also working towards our goal to not only embrace our role as community advocates, but also work with our community to build a more equitable future. The residents of those courts have already let it be known that they are not idly sitting by while the Housing Authority makes decisions about their futures. In the wake of the emerging plans to demolish those courts, evictions of courts residents have been on the rise, increasing threefold since 2010. Residents facing eviction for maintenance issues or unpaid fees feel they have no other option than to go public. We hope to channel this willingness to go public with their stories into group storytelling, like the monthly group oral history gathering you see here. We have previously collaborated with the musician Lourdes Perez to transform Westside stories into a series of songs and a book, and that is another possibility for this project. Our site is also home to a women's clay cooperative where personal stories are transformed into clay art. This is another option. That's Mujer Artes. We believe in the power of storytelling to transform lives, and we hope to launch the storytelling program with the residents of those courts to confront their impending removal due to gentrification and give them a space to share their lives in their own words and through their own through their own eyes. So that is a project that I pitched last November. We were gonna launch it this spring, kind of got derailed. It's something that I hope that Esperanza will be able to get back to. It is a real challenge to do oral histories in low-income communities right now. I know for a lot of us, we're able to Zoom with each other and we can record these things, but for people who don't have home computers or whose only real access to the internet is through their cell phone, this is a little complicated. So unfortunately, that project is on hold. At the same time, with everything that happened in the world, I had an opportunity to take this job to be the interim executive director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute in July. And it was a tough decision for me because, the Museo had been my life for a couple of years and I had all these grand plans. And, I don't know, life just sort of shifted. And so now I'm at the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. And we also are thinking about how oral history will play a major role in the work that we do in documenting the history of Mexican American civil rights, as well as the ongoing struggles for Mexican American civil rights. Let me just go to the next slide. I did just want to talk briefly before we go to questions. It's only been an hour and a half. That went fast. But I wanted to just talk to you about some of the challenges of incorporating oral histories into exhibits, which is something that I really love to incorporate oral histories into exhibits because on the one hand, oral history is such a nimble product because you can put it on the internet, you can put it on websites, you can, if you have access to radio or podcasting, you can put it there. I do come from the museum world. So I love figuring out how can we take individual stories and make them part of interactive exhibits. And so I'm just going to talk to you about some different methods that we played around with at ITC. This first slide is of images from an exhibit that I did not curate. This was actually primarily organized by Rhett Rushing, who passed away earlier this year. I'm sorry, I think it was March, can't remember. But Rhett was very involved in TOHA. And so it was very sad to lose him. But this was Rhett's exhibit. And it was for the centennial of the Mexican Revolution. And it was called Leaving Home, Finding Home. And so it was an exhibit organized around oral histories with people whose families had come to San Antonio as a result of the Mexican Revolution. And so oral histories were done with around 6 or 7 people, and then those oral histories were edited into thematic sections. So what you see in the top left there is a section about before the revolution. And so in that section, people were talking about what was going on with their families in Mexico before the revolution, right? And then it just sort of moved chronologically to, okay, and then what happened when the revolution hit? And then what was your journey, your family's journey like to Texas? How did they come to San Antonio? Why San Antonio? And then the sort of the postscript of what happened after. So each section had a television monitor mounted in this box, and then there was a sound wand. So you would pick up the sound wand to listen. We, over the years, experimented with everything. Sound wands, headphones, sound domes, all of those things. They all have pluses and minuses. But in this case, like right now, I don't think anybody wants any sound wands because you have to touch them. But they are a little bit easier in terms of reducing sound overlap than even with the domes. The sound domes do get that overlap. And then headphones can be an even bigger sanitation issue. You just have to have somebody wipe them down every, probably twice a day. As part of this exhibit, there was also a lot of collecting of photos from the people who were interviewed, as well as using the photo collection at ITC. And then those photos were mounted on these sort of projecting boards from the wall. It actually, the photo doesn't do it justice. It was quite pretty. And then we took some of the photos and enlarged them onto fabric scrims and had those as basically dividers between each section. So you would go past a scrim to get to the next section, and then there would be another scrim to get to the next section. And so in that lower left-hand photo, you can see another one of the monitors from a different section that's kind of in between two of the scrims. At the very end, of course, we wanted people to be able to share their story. San Antonio, as well as all across Texas, you have so many people who are here because of the Mexican Revolution. And so we wanted to be able to capture some of that. And so we did have this, sort of board where people could share. The exhibit itself had very few artifacts. So what you see on the right there is one of the few artifacts. And I just love this because it's a permanent resident card that a woman got. But what I love about it is, when you think exhibit, you almost automatically think, okay, stuff, artifacts, right? But this exhibit was very much about personal stories. The lighting was kind of dramatic, which made it kind of hard to photograph, but it was like this very, I don't know, like it felt like a very special space in there with the low lighting and the emphasis on listening to the words of people. So I really liked it. I realize that, the sound wands do cause some concerns for some people, especially in this moment. But this was one way of getting around how do you present oral history in an exhibit. I made a list of other things that we did while I was there. Another project that Rhett worked on was the Texas football in their words exhibit, which I don't have any photos of, but basically they made life-size cutouts of some football people from around the state. And again, they use sound wands. You pick it up and you get to hear their person's story about football. And then at the end of this row of people, cutouts of people, there was a television that was just playing on a loop, some sort of classic Texas football stuff. In Timeless Texas Toys, that was an exhibit that I curated, and which we interviewed two toy makers. And the exhibit was arranged based on sort of thematic topics. So one section was on kind of like, I don't know, old-fashioned toys. And so we had, one of the thrills of my life was doing an oral history with Tom Tierney, who, if you are a paper doll person, you know Tom Tierney, the king of paper dolls. And he lived in Smithville until his death. I got to go and interview him and in his studio in Smithville. And so he was talking about the whole history of paper dolls, as well as his career in paper dolls. We did edit it for length in this exhibit. And we, in that exhibit, because there were only two oral histories across this large gallery, and we just placed them at opposite ends, and we just used speakers, and it wasn't too bad. But on the other end was a section about handmade toys. And so in that section, we had a man named Lee Hale who makes hand-carved toys, talking about the toys that he makes and how he learned to make them. And then he's actually demonstrating how to make several of them. And so that was another concept where that exhibit was not oral history driven the way that Leaving Home, Finding Home was very much oral history driven, and yet those stories of toy makers was still there. Traveling on Fredericksburg Road was an exhibit about the history of a long arterial here in San Antonio. And for that, we interviewed a number of longtime business owners on Fred, because Fred Road is sort of a commercial arterial. And so we interviewed a number of longtime business owners, edited it into, again, sort of thematic sections, but it was just on one screen with the sound dome that you could stand under in here. And so it was sort of, what do you remember about back in the day on Fred? What are the most significant things that have happened on Fred? And what do you hope for Fred now? One of the sad things about Fredericksburg Road is once I-10 came in, once the freeway came in, Fred kind of got, I don't know, left behind, and it used to be very active, robust commercial, area, and now it's maybe a little more rundown, but it has to do with, everybody's on the freeway now. So anyway, so we did that. And then in Why We Came, which I do think I have some photos of, this was another completely oral history driven exhibit. Oh, here's Tom Tierney right here. So we had his oral history on a monitor, and we did add some graphics to his oral history. So as he's talking, we have different paper dolls that he made on this screen. And then next to it is a display of some of his original illustrations. Very cool. But this exhibit that's on the rest of the slide was Leaving Home, Finding Home, which was based on oral histories with like 16, I think, first generation Texans, people who had migrated from other countries, either for education, because they were a refugee, because of a business opportunity, various reasons. And it was designed like a game board. So you would walk in, you would spin this wheel, whatever color you would land on, you would then pick a card down here based on that color. The colors you would find out later on had to do with the reason why they migrated. But the card would have a particular person's name on it, and then you would follow that person's journey through the game board. At the end, and so over here on the right, you can just see an example of Sich van Sieve. If you had drawn his card, you would be looking for his story about how exactly he migrated, what happened on his journey to Texas. I'm sorry. And then at the very end of the exhibit, we had a place where you could record your own story about your family's migration history. And I'm so sorry. That is Brad Larson. Some of y'all might know Brad. He makes these story kiosks. And so that's a Brad Larson story kiosk right there. And finally, I do just want to go back to, at the beginning, I kept talking about place and the importance of place. I'm a really big fan of oral histories that focus on place, and that, in which you ask the person to tell you, where were the places that you used to go? Where are the places that are gone now? Where are the places that you still go? Where are the places that, that really speak to you? And then, is there a way that you can incorporate a map into the final product? This is from an oral history with Tana Lucchese, who was one of the great theater barons here in San Antonio. This is the oral history that was done a long time ago in the, the 80s. But it's so great because as somebody who's interested in the Westside, listening to this oral history and hearing him talk about these particular addresses and these particular intersections, it makes a lot of sense, but it also just tells you about the impact of, change and development in San Antonio, and that most of these places are gone now. But then, there's this map that just shows you where all these places that he mentions in his oral history are. And again, most of that is gone. Okay, I think that I'm ready for questions.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Sara, for that wonderful journey that you've taken us on. It was a very sort of thorough presentation. We have several questions that have been proposed to us, and I'm going to ask you those questions for the most part in the order that we received them, except for one question. While we begin to have this conversation, perhaps you are able to, several persons from the audience want to know if you can bring up the slide in where you provided, you showcased the equipment that you used.
Oh, yeah.
And so maybe you can have that slide up as we are having, as you're answering the rest of these questions that have been proposed by our audience. Thank you for that. Okay, so yeah, and please, some of those here who have joined us, thank you again for coming, and please feel free to type in those questions for this other part of our workshop. Okay, so here's a question that one participant asked. It has to do with where the interviewee should be looking during the interview. Where do they look? Do they look at the camera or do they look at the interviewer?
Mm-hmm. I think it's so much easier if they just look at the interviewer, because even if you've been on camera a lot, or maybe it's just me, I don't know, looking into a camera makes me nervous. So I think that it's just easier if they speak directly to you. And that setup that I was talking about is where you have the camera, so if I'm the interviewer, I have the camera just off to my right. So through my peripheral vision, I can see that little flashing red light that, okay, it's recording. And periodically I can even check to see the battery level to make sure the battery's cool. But I'm just talking to the person right here, and the camera is catching them, again, from that sort of 3/4 angle. So my idea is to keep that person as comfortable as possible. So I would say, I know that there are different strokes for different folks. I don't like I'm going to stand behind this camera, you look at the camera, and I just feel like it makes the other person uncomfortable. I want the person to be as comfortable as possible. I want it to be a fun experience. I don't put a lot of bright lights on people, and I know I'm not a cinematographer, but I don't want to make anybody those lights are hot, right? And so I just want good. I don't want the best when it comes to the video quality. A lot of these cameras these days, like the one I'm showing on the screen, even without having additional lights, it's actually very good. It's got HD quality. You don't want to be in a dark room, but just turn on the lamps, maybe open some curtains. If there's blinds, I do recommend pulling the blinds up all the way, just temporarily, and just tell them, may I open the blinds temporarily? That can help. But yeah, I just want to keep people comfortable, so I let them talk to me.
Wonderful, thank you. Here's another question. Does the historic connection in the ice house that you spoke about, does it have, does the historic connection in the ice house have with the neighborhood create a deeper connection and empowerment between community and museum, in the sense that their history will be preserved in a historic structure now, right, as you mentioned, rehabbed and preserved? Can you speak about that for a moment?
I sure hope that's the case. I mean, I think that's absolutely the intent. That so often when I was doing presentations to the community about, we're going to start this museum, what do you want to happen there? Do you want to get involved? Immediately it was like, oh, I used to go there, or oh, my dad went there, or oh, my mom shopped at the tiendita. So that personal connection to that space was very real in the community. And then also, I really do think that people are excited to see that building rehabbed as opposed to just torn down. In that video that I showed you, you could just see all the vacant lots as you go down the street. And what you didn't see was across the street. Across the street, that block has been completely flattened, and just completely. And now they're planning to build 4-story apartments there, which nothing in the neighborhood is that tall. It's going to be a real, I think it's going to be an eyesore. But I think that absolutely there is an appreciation for holding on to that history, honoring that history, rehabbing it. It's going to look beautiful. And then it's going to also be bigger. It's a small space, so it's going to be bigger with the addition, which gives more space to tell those community stories. And so, yeah, I mean, I really do hope that makes people feel good about the work that's happening there.
Thank you for that. Here's another question. What suggestions could you provide when doing oral histories in situations where the interviewees are isolated culturally, emotionally, and/or physically?
Oh, wow, that's tough. Especially it's really tough right now because you know, right now it is hard to make connections with people that you don't necessarily know very well. If you do know that person, perhaps they'd be willing to do a series of conversations with you over the phone. And if you are operating from a cell phone, there are apps you can download to record on your end, of course with their permission, right? But it is so hard right now. I know that for a lot of people, I'm thinking about like people in my family, you know, the idea of not being able to physically be with other people, it just sort of contradicts our understanding of how we're supposed to relate to each other. So that is so hard. I wish I had a better answer. If it's possible to try to, I mean, based on your time, right? Because I know we're all stretched for time. But if it's possible for you to start engaging with a person or people who you feel are isolated through the phone, building up a relationship so that later, maybe you can, especially once it gets a little cooler, maybe you can go and meet with them outdoors, and the sound quality is not going to be good if you meet outdoors, but I don't know, maybe that would be, think of it as more important for maintaining that community connection than really getting a pristine audio clip.
Thank you. Here's a question regarding the length of interviews. What is a general rule for the length of an oral history recording within the exhibit? And follow-up question is, how do you achieve editing? I imagine if you go over your general rule of length.
Yeah. So in an exhibit, it's a real challenge because people have very short attention spans. So there's a difference between somebody sitting on a computer and watching an oral history that's been loaded onto a website and being physically in an exhibit where you're standing up, most likely watching a video. So if you're standing in an exhibit watching a video, you probably want that video to be 90 seconds, which is nuts, right? That's just like a couple of sentences. If you really want them to be there for longer, I would suggest putting a bench or chairs. And just keep in mind that for older folks, benches can be hard to get up and get down onto. So if you can have chairs with armrests, that's easier for, you know, people to push themselves up and get down. But it's going to also have to do with how much space you have. Even if you have the space to provide the chairs for people to sit, you don't want to go more than like 5 minutes. It's just people, it's just a different dynamic when you're in an exhibit. People kind of want to go in and out. They don't want to necessarily spend all day there. You're going to get some people like me who love this stuff and they will spend all day in there, but that's not going to be your typical visitor. So you want to keep it as short as you can. Now you have to be so careful when you edit because you don't want to unethically change what somebody said, right? You want to make sure that whatever they were saying does not get cut off, that their point does not get skewed, does not get reinterpreted. So you have to be very careful about selecting your clips and making sure that you're not misrepresenting anything that they've said. So what I like to do is, and this makes extra work, but I actually like to transcribe it first and then go through the transcription and sort of figure out what's something that really sort of summarizes what they were trying to say about this, or what's something that works by itself without, you know, the rest of the conversation. I just find it easier for my brain to work on that when I have the transcript. But it does create an extra step. But you want to be careful about that. You don't want anybody misrepresented when you do that. And
Thank you.
did I miss anything about that question? Was there something
No,
else?
I think you were spot on. I think you were right on.
Okay.
Here's a few other questions. What are some of the ways that you address language barriers in your interviews or in the interviews and in presenting oral histories in a museum?
Yeah. So to the best of your ability, I would try to have somebody who is a native speaker doing the interview with somebody who is not comfortable in English. Now, when I say that, I do want to just add that I've had this happen to me several times, that I wanted to interview somebody and they told me, oh no, I don't speak English. And they told me this in English. And I was like, okay. And then what I have said is, well, you know, what if we had your daughter with you or your husband with you, or I don't know, some family member with you? Well, okay. And then they come in, you know, we sit down, we start the recording, and they do just fine. The person that they brought with them doesn't even need to be there. So I think sometimes people are just self-conscious that they don't have a perfect accent or whatever. But I want people to tell their stories themselves and not necessarily have to go through a translator. So if there is somebody who truly is not able to do the interview in English, then I want to get somebody who's a native speaker of whatever their native language is to do the interview. And then we'll get it translated after. But I don't, what I don't want is somebody who, like myself, who like speaks Spanish a little bit, but not great. I shouldn't be doing that, because I don't feel like that. I don't feel like my Spanish is respectful enough to do it fully in Spanish. Although that I may sound like those people who say I don't speak English and then they do fine in English, but it's their story. That's the thing. It's their story. So I want them to say it in the language that they're most comfortable in. I want them to be with somebody that they feel like they can communicate with well. Oftentimes you can find volunteers. When I was at ITC, I had an oral history with somebody who was speaking Arabic, and I just found somebody who spoke Arabic at the museum. So, you know, it was fine. We got it translated.
A related question, you know, is how the kind of barriers that you've encountered and how maybe you handle those in regards to persons who are very elderly as subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I will just say that this goes back to the sort of like rule about no judgment, right? I've had elderly people say things to me that I found kind of shocking, either because, you know, it seemed racist, or I was concerned about asking them about particular things like religion. I did a series on migrant farm workers, and I wasn't sure about this place of religion, because in these stories you had a lot of people who were involved in the church, but I wasn't sure how much we could really go into without maybe just making them subconscious or something like that. I personally think the best bet is to follow their lead, and then just you kind of have to remember that you are recording their story as they tell it, and so even if something strikes you as particularly odd or off or whatever, it's their story. The opposite side of that is that you might be interviewing somebody whose culture is just very different than yours, and so you want to make sure that you are not, I don't know, questioning that or not respecting that. I would just say, if you encounter somebody, for example, who doesn't want, oh gosh, like, you know, if you're expected to like cover your head or anything like that, I mean, you got to ask yourself, am I comfortable with that? And is it a problem for me? If it's not, then maybe you do it. If it is, maybe you find somebody else. I mean, find another interviewer. I'm always happy to train other people. I don't need to do every oral history, and I may not be the best person to do every oral history. So why not train somebody who would be a better fit and let them do it?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. In fact, that was one of our questions from a participant. They were wanting to know what you recommended for people doing oral histories who weren't necessarily a part of that community, or who identified as members of that community.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, again, it's so important that we have these spaces for history that is by, for, and about whatever that community is. So let's not be gatekeepers and say, well, I have professional training and you don't. No, train other people, you know, train other people so they can do these things for their own communities.
Thank you. Yeah. Someone asked, you know, sort of given the current situation, right, with the pandemic, and you know, how do you suggest conducting oral histories now that everything is online? Many interviewees, this person is relating, are not tech savvy, and so that this person sees having to do a lot of interviews via the phone, over the phone, and is that suitable? And
it is doable to interview people over the phone. It's not, you know, perfect, but it is doable. Know of somebody, particularly if they're elderly or they have been sick, don't let the phone scare you away. It would be better to do a phone interview than no interview. And I will just say, you know, what is it called? That World War II museum in Fredericksburg, they do so many oral histories by phone. And I think it has to do with the people they're interviewing. They're older people, you know, people in their 90s. They don't get up on Skype, or, you know, although you can do oral histories on Skype, right? But they're not doing that. So they're using the phone. So you can. I love video just because I like to be able to see the person. But I don't know, these times call for whatever you can make work.
yeah. And somewhat related to that, another question had to deal with the gadgets, right? They call it the gadgets. I imagine it's the recording equipment, especially for those who need to learn how to operate that equipment. Have you found that the more that they put their hands on it, the more comfortable they feel, or how long does something like that happen for them?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea with these kits that we put together and the workshops that we had is we let everybody touch everything. And I know that's kind of problematic right now, but before we were letting everybody touch everything. Nothing that we purchased was super expensive. So if something were to happen, it was replaceable. Both the video camera and the digital audio recorder have the little SD chips inside. So for example, if they dropped it and broke it, the SD chip would probably be fine, and so the data would still be there. I always encourage them to check out the kits, you know, a couple of days before they're actually going to do the interview, so they can do some test runs at home. But in the workshop, we also just sort of walk through how to turn everything on. Most of these things have just basically a one button to go. That Canon camera, it has just one button to start. You push the same button to stop. So it's pretty simple. The same thing with that audio recorder. It's just one button to record. The button next to it says stop. I do wish the text on the buttons was larger, but it's not. So anyway, but I don't know if anybody remembers, but back in the day, there were these little, I actually have one over here. One second, I'll grab it. This is my little old school camera. I don't know if y'all remember these, but they used to make these in the early 2000s. Unfortunately, they're all out of production, but these little cameras, that they do have a hole to attach to a tripod. You might be able to find this on eBay. They record in HD, and what's great about it is it's literally one button. One button to start, one button to stop, that's it. I loved these, and I wish they were still in production, but they're not.
Thank you. Someone offered and suggested that Zoom, right? What we're using now is also a good recorder, and so thank you for offering that.
Yeah, if
Here's
you have a computer or a laptop, tablet, even a cell phone, but if you're going to do it on a cell phone, I would encourage them to turn it horizontally.
yeah.
Mhm.
Who has been, we're sort of talking about these toolkits. Someone asked, right, who's coming to get the toolkits? Is it young people? Is it older people? Is it mostly Latinos who are coming to get these, who's doing the interviews?
For the Museo del Westside's training, we almost overwhelmingly were having other Latinos, Mexican Americans come in to do the workshops. And it had to do with where we were going, I think, right? But they were all ages. So the ones that we hosted at Casa de Cuentos at the Rinconcito de Esperanza, we had all ages, including younger folks, like, you know, people in their 20s, people who are in college and were looking for, you know, something to do, like for extra credit. But then we also did workshops at the senior center. And so of course there it was seniors, right? I really think that anybody can learn to do this. I would hope that, you know, that we are trying to get those intergenerational connections. I actually think that the Latino community generally does a good job at intergenerational connections, but making sure that we get those stories recorded. You know, younger people who are, you know, in their late teens, early 20s are great for interviewing their grandparents. And so I don't, like for me, and I'm not there anymore, but I would never put an age restriction on this. Like even if they're, you know, 14 and they want to give it a shot, again, they're not that expensive, and you know, if they're willing to sit through the 2-hour workshop, okay, let's give you a chance.
Yeah, we have a few museum questions, but we have 2 more interview questions that I want to ask. One is in preparing your interviewers. What kind of conversations do you have with them regarding what they might potentially hear from the persons they're interviewing? I mean, in terms of using oppressive language or offensive language or something that might irk them. How do you train for something like that? What do you tell your trainees?
Yeah, you know, I have yet to experience anybody really using offensive language. Mostly what I have experienced is like, I think things that people don't realize are not really socially acceptable anymore. But I think that if you grew up with, you know, grandparents of a certain age, maybe it's not utterly shocking, just more like, I can't believe you're still saying that. But I will just say, going back to that idea about no judgment, people may say things that you just find really nuts, like, you know, that women shouldn't be driving, or that women shouldn't be, I don't know, going to bars or whatever, right? Like people have these, I don't know, particular values that are often rooted in another time and, you know, another generation. Maybe it's cultural, I don't know. This is not the time to get into a fight with somebody about, you know, that's ignorant. You can be thinking that, but it's not going to help the interview for you to say that. So yeah, I do think that it's important that people understand that they're going to encounter potentially things that they don't agree with, but it's not your story, it's their story. You don't have to agree with everything they say. I would personally say if somebody does use offensive language, I do think you have the right to say, I'm not comfortable with that. Can you not do that?
Our last question, as it relates to the interviews, we have a few that people have asked regarding the museum. But someone asked, you know, do you let the interviewees get a hold of the transcripts? I mean, we know you give them, they get those.
Yeah, definitely. It does take a while, especially at a small place like the Museo del Westside, but honestly, even at ITC, we had this backlog of things that needed to be transcribed. So transcription can just take a while. There are these nifty software things that make it a little bit easier now, like the Google if you use the Google version of Word that has a voice dictation that you can like play the recording, and you know, you're still gonna have to go through it again. It's not good at all with people who are bilingual and, you know, like code switch. But there are some little tricks you can use for slightly faster transcribing, but it does take a while. But I absolutely, if they want a transcript, I'm more than happy to give them a transcript. And in some cases, and this isn't very common, but every now and then you will interview somebody who might tell you something that later on they say, I probably shouldn't have told you that. The easiest way to fix that is to give them the transcript and have them mark what they want taken out, and then you can cut that clip from the tape itself, from the digital file. But you gotta be careful about that. You do not want everybody backtracking on their story. It's really just for those special cases where maybe they said something that wasn't, particularly if it could put somebody in danger or something like that. But I would not make that a common situation. I've only had it come up a couple of times, but anyway, but yeah, give them a transcript.
Here, just a few questions regarding the museum. We were talking about using maybe sensitive language in the interviews for constructing these exhibits with people's personal items, right? Photographs and even stories. How do you deal with people's sort of personal things that go up into the museum? And I guess, I mean, is it on loan to the museum, or do they donate it to the museum? You know,
now it's gonna depend on the particular case, but typically what we were doing was only getting a digital image of whatever it was. So if it was a photograph or a newspaper clipping, we would just make a digital scan of it, and they would get to keep the original. Now, in some cases, they do want to find a permanent home for those sorts of things. If they do, you want to make sure you get a deed of gift for that item. But even if you do a scan, and I can provide you with a basic form, but anything that I scan, I have them fill out a form explaining what it is, you know, who's in the image, approximately what year, if they know the address the photo was taken out, that's even better. As much information as they know goes on that form, but also just, you know, I'm giving you permission to use this digital image in future, and then there's a whole list of potential things, right? Website, exhibit, you know, on and on and on. And that way you've covered your bases. You don't ever want to use something without permission.
Yeah. Somebody asked, how do you make the people feel that the museum is their museum? I mean, does that happen? And if so, to what degree does that happen?
Well, you know, at the Museo, that was really a big goal, was to make the community feel like this is your museum, that you have that ability to help us shape what is coming in the exhibit, in the future exhibits, and you know, by the time I left, we hadn't even started the rehab of the building. So I think there's still going to be a lot of work to do, but I will just tell you that it did seem like people were very excited. They had submitted so many ideas for exhibits that once those doors are open, they will be busy for many years creating those exhibits. But I think that you never want to take your community for granted, right? Like, just because you did some community meetings last year doesn't mean you never have to do community meetings again. This should always be happening. You know, there should always be community meetings, because people's needs are going to evolve, especially right now. People's needs are so different right now than they were a year ago. So how are we keeping in touch with what people's needs are now? And that doesn't mean we just throw out the ideas from last year, but it does mean that those ideas need to evolve and they need to keep changing. And so community engagement is a long-term commitment. That I think is what's most important. People won't feel connected to a community museum if it seems like, oh, you only come to us when you're applying for a grant and then you forget about us.
Yeah. Here's the last question we have about the museums. On the property in where the museum sits and establishing that as a historical district, does that help open up a dialogue regarding gentrification, or also do you think that can also slow down the process of gentrification?
I wonder if I know who asked that. I don't have no idea who asked that, but that's such a good question. That is very much why we wanted to create that historic district, because not only was it just sort of appalling that the Westside, such a historic community, such an important neighborhood to the development of San Antonio, the fact that there was no historic district was just crazy. But as this gentrification is coming, and we know it's coming, creating a historic district actually creates protections for that area. So now, and honestly, all a historic district is an extra layer of, it's called a zoning overlay. But basically it requires an extra layer of due diligence if anyone were ever to apply for a demolition permit. So just because something is in a historic district doesn't mean it can't be demolished, but it's harder to demolish it because you have to go through some extra steps. In our case, in San Antonio, a few years ago, they changed the Unified Development Code, or the city code, so that now new historic districts actually receive tax benefits. So if you're in a historic district, you can get your taxes frozen for about 15 years. That's not going to impact the Esperanza too much because Esperanza is a nonprofit. But if that were actually residential property, the folks living in those homes would be able to reduce their tax debt by getting their taxes frozen. And honestly, right now, the skyrocketing property taxes are a huge challenge for folks who are working class. They own the home. The home has been in the family for a few generations. It's maybe not, it's not a big home. Maybe it's small, maybe it's humble, maybe it needs a lot of maintenance, but it's theirs. They own it. It's an asset they can pass down to the next generation. And so getting those property taxes reduced is just huge. It also, again, if you have a historic district, if some developer wants to come in and build 4-story apartment buildings for, people who want to live downtown and has rents that are astronomical for the neighborhood, they would have to get their plans approved by the city because they would have to meet the guidelines for the historic district. So we really actually do see historic districts and historic preservation policies as a potential sort of way to push back gentrification, slow it down. I don't know that there's any way to completely stop it, but if we can slow it down, help people stay in their homes, that would be just hugely beneficial.
Dr. Gould, just as I was saying, this is our last question. We had 2 more questions come in,
okay,
and I hope that's okay. These are related to the equipment. One question is there a second person that also, sort of helps with the interview that oversees the equipment? And so are there multiple people doing the interviews, one managing the equipment? And the other question had to do more specifically with a camcorder, right? The question is a camcorder better than an SLR? And I have to admit, I don't know what an SLR is with video, is their question. Is a camcorder better than SLR with video?
Okay. So let me take the second part first. SLRs are expensive. So like the camera I'm showing you here is like $200. So if you can afford an SLR, go for it. But those are expensive. And then, what was the first question?
Is there a second person at the interview overseeing the equipment?
Yeah, I don't usually use a second person. That doesn't mean you can't, I think if you have the manpower, now when I train community members to do this, I'm training them to do it on their own. But if they felt better having a second person with them handling the equipment, I don't see any problem with that. The only thing you want to do is just make sure that they've both gone through the same training, because again, we talked before about when you're doing the oral history, you don't want to interrupt. And I know for myself, and I think it's just because of the way I was raised to, like, you know, if you're paying attention, you're saying, yeah, But when you're doing your oral history, you don't do that, right? You ask the question and then you zip it and you let them speak, because you don't want to accidentally interject when they were about to finish a thought or something like that. So what I do when I do oral histories is I like maniacally nod my head so that they know that I'm listening to them. You just want to make sure if you're going to have a second person that they understand so I would say, you know, go through this training together so that you both know my role is mostly to be silent and mostly to just be listening. But there's no problem with having a second person.
Great, thank you. Here's another. How do you organize an exhibition with material from the community with some artistic, I'm sorry, we discussed that. What piece of advice would you give to a graduate student? Here's one. What piece of advice would you give to a graduate student wanting to conduct oral histories for dissertation research?
Okay, well, the good news is that you no longer have to get IRB approval for oral histories, which you used to have to do, which was a real pain. So that's great. So honestly, you know, I would probably maybe pick up like the oral history handbook that AASLH came out with last year, I think it was, just to make sure, or I can send you slides. If you send me your email, I can send you some training slides to just help you get going. All you need to do is just make sure you've got yourself covered with the release forms. Make sure you have some equipment, and it's possible that at your school they even have some equipment you could check out. I know a lot of libraries actually do have basic equipment. If you have a smartphone, if you have a tablet, you can use those things. If you want to use Zoom or Skype, you can do that. I mean, when I was in grad school, I basically taught myself just by reading how to do it. And at that time, it was a little different because you had to do IRB. But now you don't, so it's much easier. I highly encourage you to do it.
Yeah, thank you. And you said something that was very critical. People are wanting to know, are any of the slides that you shared with us, could those be made available to some of our listeners and participants?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, it seems that the questions have sort of ceased for the moment. But so we want to thank you, Dr. Gould, for, again, spending your day with us and sharing the work that you do. We thank you, and we are absolutely tremendously grateful for this experience. People have expressed on the chat that this has been a wonderful presentation, and I agree. Yeah, I agree, and I think that all of the TOHA membership agrees as well. As we conclude today's workshop, I want to remind all of our participants that if you had not had a chance to register for tonight's event, please do so. At 6 o'clock tonight, we are screening a documentary called Impact. And so please make sure you come back for that. I also want to let everyone know that we at TOHA are proud to announce that this year's program is made possible in part with grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we want to thank them, and we definitely want to thank also Dr. Gould, who is currently the interim executive director for the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, and who shared with us, right, the work that she did with El Museo del Westside, the community-based and hands-on museum. It was such a wonderful program, and we were glad that we can do it. The pandemic slowed us down, but it didn't stop us. Thank you.